Okay, we are live now. It takes like 5 seconds to go live on YouTube.
Okay.
I'll just check here. There are 10 people watching already. So
Nice. What time will we start? Give it a few minutes.
yeah, we should probably give like 5 minutes or something so people can get in.
Okay.
Okay, the number of people is increasing. So you can check like now in the comment section. People are starting.
Let's see. Yeah, I don't understand.
Yeah. Okay. So after you can check the answers if you want.
Yeah, no problem.
Então, boa tarde para todo mundo, pessoal. Acho que a gente deu. Nós vamos começar daqui uns minutinhos, só tô dando um tempinho para o pessoal poder entrar e tal. Mas logo a gente vai começar a apresentação do Zack, e aí eu vou apresentar ele direitinho, tudo bem. Tá? Então, pode ficar tranquilos. Só dá mais até uns 4 minutinhos para o pessoal conseguir entrar. Né? Só um disclaimer, porque assim, o Zack não entende muito português, então se alguém quiser falar com ele diretamente, pode falar com ele em inglês. Se você quiser falar com ele em português, eu consigo traduzir, né? Mas a princípio tem que ser em inglês. Okay, we have like 20 people watching now, so
Okay.
don't get nervous.
I'm all good.
Okay, Dylan is watching us. He said you were going to try to give your lecture in Portuguese.
That's what I told him. I told him I was going to try.
I think we can go now. It's like we gave 4 minutes. So, então, boa tarde para todo mundo. Aqui nós voltamos mais uma vez para os seminários quinzenais do programa de pós-graduação em Ecologia e Evolução da Unifesp. Eu queria agradecer a participação do Zack, que é um estudante de doutorado da Universidade Estadual do Arizona, em Tempe, e ele vai falar um pouquinho para nós hoje sobre o trabalho dele. Então, sobre a dissertação dele no doutorado e tudo mais. Então, caso vocês tenham alguma dúvida, vocês podem mandar a pergunta mesmo em português, que eu passo para ele a mensagem depois da apresentação dele. Mas se vocês quiserem também fazer a pergunta em inglês direto, é melhor, porque aí todo mundo vai treinando e se divertindo. Tá? Então, queria agradecer ao Zack, né? E agora vamos passar para ele, tá? So, I've made the proper introductions in foreign language, and thank you for taking the time to talk with us about your research today. So I'm gonna relay it to you so you can do your thing. If you want to share the screen.
All right. Yep. Thank you so much for the introduction, even though I have no idea what you said. Hopefully it was all good things. Try to get my screen shared here.
Yeah.
One second. The presentation closed for some reason.
Sempre só uns pequenos detalhes de tecnologia. E para aqueles eu vou estar aqui, tá? Eu só vou sair da tela para deixar só o Zack, mas eu vou estar observando vocês aí nos comentários. O olho que tudo vê.
All right, I got it now. Hold on.
Okay. Just waiting here for your screen to pop up here.
All right, do you see that?
Yep.
Great. Okay,
So
I'm ready to go.
Yeah, I'll be on the backstage if you need me. Just shout.
Yeah, if anything happens that I'm unaware of, let me know.
Okay, cool. See you in a bit.
Great. All right, well, thank you everyone for coming here again. I'm really excited to be giving this talk. I'm going to be going over almost everything that I've been doing over the past 4 years at Arizona State University. I'm currently doing my PhD and hopefully finishing up this year. And the presentation will all be about communication and fighting behavior in crayfish and how honest and dishonest communication plays a role in that system. It's something I'm really excited to be talking about with all of you. So before I really get into kind of like the nitty gritty here, I just want to make sure everyone's familiar with the terminology and everything that I'll be using throughout the talk. So communication or signaling is when there's generally 2 individuals involved. We can call them the sender and we can call them the receiver, and senders send information also called signals to receivers. Okay, so just some very basic terminology here. And all of these different types of communication and signaling are fundamental to lots of biological processes. So whether it's cells communicating to cells or plants communicating to animals in the form of, and this helps pollination, or animals communicating to other animals. So I spend most of my time thinking about animals. And when we think of communication in animals, it's really fundamental to a lot of the ecological and evolutionary processes that kind of drive evolution. So animals communicate using signals in order to choose mates. So there's tons of research on, the color or the size of a signal and how that influences one's ability to mate. Animals communicate in order to signal territoriality, and they're fighting and aggressive behavior. So, there's species of lizards that have these beautiful colors, and they pair these beautiful colors with some sort of display. And these are signals that have evolved to communicate information. And animals even communicate in order to forage, such as social insects and ants. So very, very fundamental. So if we think about why these signals evolve, it kind of helps set up the rest of the talk. So if we think of some animal that does not have any signal, and then all of a sudden, some aspect of the organism gets really large or gets really conspicuous and beautiful, we can see that this can have tons of benefits for individuals that are able to signal. So if we imagine a scenario where their animals are fighting over resources, like on the left here, where there's no signaling, these animals may just get into a territorial interaction and fight, and they can both get injured, and it ends up being bad for both of them. However, if animals are able to signal, they're able to both benefit from this interaction because they can communicate their intention or their ability or their quality beforehand. So it ends up being a really beneficial strategy for both sender and receiver. And the reason that these traits evolve, these signals evolve, is because there's a correlation between the size of the trait or the color of the trait or the intensity of the trait and some quality or some information that it is portraying. So for a given size, an example here is this beautiful claw of a fiddler crab. For a given size, it honestly communicates its quality in this example because there's a nice tight correlation. If you are bigger than another individual, you're a likely higher quality than the other individual in this scenario. Okay, so this is what we call an honest signal or a reliable signal. And again, this is based on this really beautiful tight correlation. And this is why signals evolve, because they contain honest or reliable information. When we think about examples of honest or reliable signaling, this has been studied for years because it's so important in understanding how and why animals communicate. So the example on the left here is from collared lizards, which display these jaw these flanges on their jaw, which honestly communicate the amount of force that they can generate with their bites. Is a really nice statistical observable correlation between these things. So it honestly signals or reliably signals their fighting ability. The gular pouch of some frigate birds signals their parasite resistance. So only the highest quality males can produce the reddest and most beautiful pouches here that we have. And then even we can think of humans and, car collections or any accumulation of wealth. The number of cars that someone has is correlated to their wealth. Okay, so it's an honest or reliable signal of their wealth in these examples. So for these signals to evolve, on average, both the signaler and the receiver must benefit from participating in communication. And this makes sense, just like the benefit of signaling that I demonstrated with the crab with the giant claw. So people thought for years that signals should be honest, but people soon realized that this is on average, it only makes evolutionary sense for signals to evolve if they both benefit. It doesn't have to be every single interaction. So even though signals should be honest, they can be dishonest. And people have documented dishonesty in dishonest signals for years. So we can think of mimicry in some plants and other animals. An example is a bee orchid, which has actually evolved to look like a male or a female bee and smell like a female bee. And actually male bees will come and mate with it, even though it is obviously not a female bee. There's also false alarm calls in plenty of birds. So an example is the fork-tailed drongo, who normally will give a call that a predator is in the air if a predator is in the air, and that would be an honest signal. But sometimes if they really want a resource, they will give a dishonest alarm call. They will call to everyone in the environment that there's a predator when there's actually not a predator. And then this allows them to get all the resources that they want during this time. So these are dishonest signals. And when we think about the relationship between some signal and some quality or some sort of information, dishonest or unreliable signals occur when there's a breakdown between this really nice tight correlation. In this spread of data, you can't really predict what's going on. If I give you one signal, you might think that I'm high quality, you might think that I'm low quality, and this variation leads to dishonest signaling. So the breakdown between the signal and the underlying quality can be thought of as dishonest signaling. So interestingly, despite people thinking that dishonesty was rare, crustaceans are great organisms for studying all of these types of questions and understanding how and why dishonest signals evolve. So I'm going to walk you through some of the the history of studying dishonest signaling in crustaceans, and this will lead really nicely into the work that I'm trying to do for my PhD. So some of the first examples came from dishonest signaling in mantis shrimp. And these are marine crustaceans that are fairly small, about the size of a pencil, but they can be even smaller. And normally what they do is they occupy burrows during the day. And these burrows are clearly important for both mating and safety from predators. So you need to be in a burrow if you're a mantis shrimp. And these mantis shrimp have these appendages that look like hammers that they can use to smash one another. So they're fairly aggressive. And if there's an individual that is not in a burrow, he will try to evict an individual that is in a burrow. And generally, the size of the individual or the size of the signal on the claw or on the hammer that they use correlates to the amount of damage that they can inflict. So this makes sense. So generally, this is a fairly honest system of communication. However, sometimes an individual will molt. And when crustaceans molt, they get extremely soft, and you can pretty much squish them instantly. So they're extremely soft, and they actually can't even deal damage when they have recently molted. However, researchers noticed that these recently molted individuals were extremely aggressive. They were hyper aggressive. So they were behaving as if they weren't even, as if they could deal damage, and the receivers actually believed it, okay? So what would happen is that there's a breakdown in the relationship between the size or the quality of the individual and the amount of damage they can inflict, which is overall the information that they're interested in. So this breakdown between this due to the molted individuals can best be interpreted as dishonest signaling. And this is one of the first examples that people were looking for to study dishonest signaling in nature. And unfortunately, not many follow-up studies have been done, but fortunately, other species have kind of taken over, and they are also crustaceans. So again, I'm going to be discussing the example of the fiddler crabs. And these fiddler crabs are amazing. The males of the species wield a giant claw that can be up to 40% of their body weight. And normally, this claw is pretty robust and has all of these tubercles, which are these bumps that they can use to really increase the mechanical advantage and pinch really hard. And what they do is they wave these claws around in order to attract mates, and they wave them around in order to defend a territory. And they will signal to each other their quality, because the underlying quality that they're interested in is the strength. The strength is what really determines who wins these territorial interactions. And so these are all for original claws, but sometimes the fiddler crabs actually drop their claw, perhaps due to predation or a bad fight, and they will regenerate a new one. And the new one gets to the same size, if not even longer, but they invest very little into the muscle. So this is been interpreted as a dishonest signal, because we could see with the claw size on the x-axis here, just demonstrated by a principal component score, and the y-axis of claw strength, the original claws are fairly strong and predictable, and so are the regenerated claws, but the individuals cannot tell the difference between these two. So there's fiddler crabs that have this really big, beautiful claw, and they're waving it around as if they were high quality, and it fools all of the other individuals who are actually stronger than them, who would actually beat them in a fight. It fools them into thinking that they are stronger than they are. So it's a dishonest signal. And again, despite people thinking that dishonest signals are rare or dishonesty doesn't occur in nature, up to 40% of fiddler crabs within a population can possess a regenerated dishonest claw. And so the ranges can be from anywhere to 5%, but the highest ever reported is 40% from what I've found. So in both of these systems, we see how a breakdown in the honest or reliable correlation between a trait and the quality that it is portraying or signaling can lead to dishonesty. And lastly, dishonest signaling can occur in crayfish, and it's fairly similar to the fiddler crab, where for a given claw size, there's tons of variation, although the research that has been done previously has not been able to link this to the regenerated claw. So for a given size, you could be the biggest individual in a population, and you could have a 10-fold difference in the strength that you were able to produce. So in these freshwater crayfish, there's also likely opportunities for dishonest signaling from what we have studied so far. And remember, these are dishonest signals because the claw size is used as a signal, and it predicts who engages in aggression. So they go around and they interlock their claws and display their claws to each other. But when there's actual physical interaction, the strength determines who wins. And the claw size does not predict the claw strength at all, okay? So in all of these examples, there's this breakdown between signal and the overall information, and people have interpreted this as dishonest signaling. It's fairly rare in other groups, but crustaceans, it seems to be common. So around 20 years ago, the literature said that dishonesty likely doesn't occur in nature, and if it does, it's very rare, or at least very rare. But more recently, studies in crustaceans seem to demonstrate that it can be rare, okay? It can be actually a majority strategy, is what theoretical models have predicted, but the empirical data has been lagging behind that, and crustaceans are probably one of the best systems to answer these questions. So some work has been done on the stomatopods, the mantis shrimp with the hammers. Lots of work has been done on fiddler crabs, but crayfish are relatively unexplored, and we don't know much about the honest or dishonest communication in this system. And crayfish are extremely diverse, and that's why I really wanted to try to use them as a model organism to study this. So we don't know how common dishonest signals are throughout crustaceans. We know it can likely occur in some species, but we don't know how common it is, or whether it's a taxa-wide phenomenon, or whether it's only the species that researchers ended up studying. We don't know much about the mechanisms that produce these signals. It seems related to molting, but it's kind of different in each species because the fiddler crabs have claw regeneration, but the crayfish, there has previously been no evidence for that. And we also don't know the ecological factors that relate to dishonesty. So we have all this theory that tells us when we should see dishonest signaling, but we have very little empirical data to back that up. So freshwater crayfish are great for this. There's over 700 species worldwide. One of the diversity hotspots is in the eastern United States. The other diversity hotspot of freshwater crayfish is in northeastern Australia. Within the group, there's great variation in the way that they look, the size and the shape of their claws. There's great variation in how they behave and their ecological importance and their overall natural and life history. Lots of variation to take advantage of here to try to leverage interesting studies of dishonest communication. And crayfish have already been model organisms for studying aggression and communication for years. So we can take all this information that we already know and apply this new framework of dishonest signaling and trying to understand how and why these signals evolve in some scenarios, but not others, and use freshwater crayfish to study this. So I have a video here of crayfish fighting. It may be a little slow and not work that well. I will try my best here. But generally what happens is that these crayfish will interlock their claws in multiple bouts. And these fights can be pretty intense and they can last up to an hour sometimes. If the individuals are really closely sized matched here, what they will do is they will have this direct fight that ends up in pinching and flipping and grappling. But if there's a big difference in the size of their claws, previous research has shown that they won't even fight and they'll just signal to each other their size, and the smaller one, of course, runs away because it's more beneficial. Okay, so hopefully you can see at least some of that fight there, and so you can get an idea of what I'm talking about here. So to study honest and dishonest communication in crayfish, I wanted to take a wide approach and study it from multiple levels of analysis, from proximate to ultimate. And so you can ask these questions by understanding the function, the evolution, the mechanism, and the development. Today, I'm going to be focusing on the first three, which are each their own kind of separate question and different way of getting at overall understanding dishonest communication in crayfish. I will be focusing on those three. I have some ideas and plans to study the development of these dishonest signals and these honest signals, but that's going to be saved for another talk. So the first thing I wanted to do is, we know that the fiddler crab, the dishonesty is related completely to the fact that their claws can regenerate. And when they regenerate their claws, they regenerate them to be very large, but they don't regenerate, they don't invest much muscle tissue in there. Okay, so they're kind of dishonestly signals when they have it regenerated. So this was the first thing that I wanted to look at. I did this with a species that is invasive in Arizona, which is the state where I'm doing my PhD, and this crayfish is Faxinais virilis. It is native to the Great Lakes region of the United States, so that's a very cold part of the United States, and currently I'm in a very hot part, but they are extremely well adapted here. So I got a whole bunch of males of this species, and I got great measurements of their claw to get using linear morphometrics to characterize the size and the shape of their claw. And then I measured their strength by using a force transducer. And if you've ever picked up any crustacean, really, they're super aggressive. And if you put anything in their claw, they will pinch it super hard. And I have tons of data that shows that this pinch measurement that I can gather is super repeatable across days, across treatments, etc. So I can get the size of the claw and the strength of the claw, just like the fiddler crab data. So what we see here is eerily similar to the fiddler crab data. When we look at the normal claws, which are these big, robust claws that have tubercles, and then when we look at the regenerated claws, which are these long, thin, slender claws that kind of look like scissors, we find that for a given size, the regenerated claws are much weaker. So the red dots and the red line here represents the normal original clause, okay? And the regenerated dots are represented by the open white circles in the black line. And we can see that for a given size, the regenerated clause on average about 30% weaker. And again, we could see all of this variation in this data. So if you're a really large individual, they have no idea how strong you are. You know, you could be pinching 3 newtons, which is not that hard. It's kind of just like a normal pinch from a human, or you could be pinching about 30 newtons, close to 30 newtons. And this will actually draw blood most of the time if they get you in the right spot. So the regenerated claws are a good bit weaker, on average 30%, like I mentioned. And this is exactly what we would predict if these claws functioned as dishonest signals. We could see, just putting the figures right next to each other, it's fairly similar. There's more there's a bigger gap between the original and the regenerated claws and the original fiddler crab data that was collected. But in crayfish, it's fairly similar. So I was feeling pretty good at this point when I got this result, because I really thought that, you know, maybe there is dishonest communication in this species of crayfish at least. And the mechanism is that it's the regenerated claws. It could be exactly like the fiddler crabs. However, just because we have this relationship, it does not mean that the signal is dishonest. Okay, to figure out whether the signal is dishonest, you need to conduct experiments and behavioral experiments. So that gets at the function. Are these signals adaptive? Are they even signals? You know, what's the function of this variation due to the regeneration in these crustaceans? So the prerequisites to determine if these claws function as dishonest signals, remember, is that there's this large variation between the size and the strength of claws. We have that, okay? We definitely have this large variation, and a lot of the variation is attributed to the fact that the claws are regenerated. Second, we need to see that the claw size is used as a signal. It determines whether or not they're even going to engage in aggression. So we need to show that. And then we also need to show that the claw strength determines the outcome of aggression when individuals engage in combat. So those are the prerequisites I was looking to show if dishonesty was present in this system. If I can't show that, dishonesty might not be present. So I conducted 2 experiments. The first experiment was with the same species as before, vaccinized gorillas. I did male-male fights and female-female fights. Interestingly, female crayfish also have claws. They're a little bit smaller than the males, but they still fight. So crayfish are great organisms for studying this. And then I conducted territorial interactions, close to 100 in total for this experiment. And you could just have these crayfish in an arena, and they acclimate for 10 minutes, and then you release a barrier, and they will fight almost instantly. You can easily decide who wins by the repeated chasing and fleeing behavior when a dominant hierarchy is formed. So that's another thing that's great about the crayfish, is that there's very clear dominance hierarchies. Once an individual is deemed the loser, it'll get chased around the arena for 10, 20, 30 minutes. So again, I got great data on the claws. I got the pinching strength data. I did the territorial interactions, and I measured other morphological variables such as body size. So firstly, I found that both male and female claws were very variable. And a lot of this variation was attributed to the regenerated claws. So the males are represented by the black dots here, and the females are represented by the open dots, the open circles. And we can see that there's variation in both males and females, which is interesting because the males fight more. I was predicting that perhaps there would be greater variation in the males, but there's actually no statistically greater variation. So importantly, some of these fights did not reach physical contact, right? Because they were resolved through signaling, whereas others did. And when we look at what actually predicted the outcome of these interactions, to do this, I did multimodal averaging using all of the different morphological variables that we predicted would influence fighting. So that's body size, claw strength, etc. We found that when fights were resolved through signaling, so no physical interaction was actually occurring, that body size predicted the outcome of these interactions. Okay, so if you were larger than the opponent, so this is what is represented on the x-axis here. If you're larger than your opponent, you are more likely to win, your body size, that is. If you're smaller than your opponent, you are very unlikely to win, okay? Furthermore, when these fights escalated to combat, we saw that both body size and claw strength predicted the outcome of these aggressions. A model containing both of these factors was extremely likely, about 90% weight. And importantly, the difference in body size was a better predictor though. Okay, so from the first experiment, we did not show that the claw size determines whether they engage in aggression, okay? So that doesn't support the idea that they function as dishonest signals, but the claw strength did have an influence on the outcome of aggression, even though body size was a better predictor. So we have some evidence there. Okay, so we're not really sure, but and that's why I wanted to conduct a second experiment. Not sure if these variable signals are actually adaptive or not. So then I conducted a second experiment. This experiment involved way more trials, so 160 in total. And I used both Vaccinitis virilis and a second species in Arizona, Procambarus clarki. And I conducted both intraspecific fights, so within each species, and then interspecific fights, so across the species. Very similar methods as before. I did all of the exact same data collection, except now I have more fights, and I also have intraspecific fights and interspecific fights. So again, some fights did not reach physical combat, whereas others did. So we see that, oh, and then importantly, this is also only males. So I only used males for the second experiment. So we see that both species possess claws that unreliably predicted their strength. Okay, so both of these species have these very variable claws that, you know, if you're for a given size, you're not really sure how strong you are. If you're really small, you can predict fairly well. And these are still adults down here with really small claws, which do fight still. And it's a pretty good predictor, but as you get the spread out, you'll see that it's really hard to predict. And we can see that the closed circles are Procambarus clarki, whereas the blue circles are the same species as before, Vaccinitis virilis. So regardless of whether the fight was intra or interspecific, depicted by the different colors here, we see that claw size predicted the outcome of these interactions, okay? Whether or not you're facing someone of your own species or someone of a different species. Claw size was by far the only variable that predicted any fight outcome. Furthermore, when these individuals engaged in combat, again, claw size predicted this outcome. And it was way better than body size, way better than claw strength. Claw strength didn't predict anything. It was like it didn't even matter. And this is really interesting. You know, it doesn't follow what we thought was going to happen at all based on the variance observed in the claws. So the second experiment, we have some support that claw size determines whether or not they engage in aggression, but claw strength did not predict anything here, okay? So we have super mixed support, and that's fairly, it's hard to interpret in the same framework, and I would love to discuss more about that if you guys have any questions. Okay, so we have these variable signals. We think that if they are dishonest, they are related to the regenerated claws, but we don't see that these signals actually, you know, are really even used as signals. They don't predict it in the way, predict the outcomes of aggression like we would think. So we're really not sure if these variable signals are even dishonest signals. Okay, they're unreliable, but they may not be dishonest. So I wanted to take a more comparative approach because a lot of this information that I'm telling you has only been extrapolated from a few species. You know, one mantis shrimp species, and then, you know, a handful of fiddler crab species. I wanted to get a more comparative approach and take advantage of some of this diversity in freshwater crayfish. So I wanted to find out with crayfish, if they have different divergent lifestyles, does it change the amount or the degree of dishonesty in their signals or the unreliability? And so this is getting at the evolution of these, you know, variable signals. So everything I've mentioned about crayfish so far has to do with stream-dwelling crayfish. And stream-dwelling crayfish are what you would think of. They live in water. They defend territories in open water. They're generally fairly big. They can get up to the size of my hand on average, and they're super aggressive, okay? So these are the crayfish that people use when they're studying fighting behavior. And their claws, and many species, it's been documented that the claws evolve as signals and as weapons. So they're super aggressive. However, there are also burrowing species of crayfish which live almost their entire lives underground, and they're extremely poorly studied. On average, they're going to be a little bit smaller than a stream-dwelling crayfish, and they live in these isolated mud burrows. And interestingly, they do not fight. So their claws are not signals. Their claws are not weapons. They're just tools used for digging. We can see that the morphology is very different. You know, the stream-dwelling crayfish, they carry their claws out like this, whereas the burrowing crayfish carry them like that. Completely different morphology and behavior here. And so if we think that these dishonest signals are really dishonest signals, only the stream-dwelling crayfish should possess them because they're the ones that fight. The burrowing crayfish, their claws need to function as digging tools. So there should be very little variation between the size and the strength of their claws. So we can use the burrowing crayfish as a comparative control to try to understand the baseline variation in these crayfish, and then compare it to whether there's lots of dishonesty or unreliability in a second comparison, and that's the stream-dwelling species. So all of these species were collected in the northeastern United States, around Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, and throughout West Virginia. Most of my collection occurred, within a few hours of Pittsburgh. There's, about 15 species within this whole state. I collected primarily outside of Pittsburgh. I got 3 stream-dwelling species for the study and 3 burrowing species. And you can see that I got a lot more stream-dwelling species because they're fairly easy to catch. The burrowing species are really difficult to catch. It took me, I probably got one every 2 hours. So for example, getting 40 Canberra monongalensis took me well over a week alone. And this is every single day going out there. And they live in these mud burrows, which makes it really hard because you can either dig them up, which is extremely laborious, or you can plunge them out of their burrow, actually. And that's what I ended up doing. So you fill their burrow with water and you plunge them out and they come to investigate. And I have a short video here of a burrowing crayfish coming to investigate. So normally they don't get close to the water, but this crayfish, I just plunged its burrow and it wants to investigate what's going on. And then you can catch them fairly easily. So this is a burrowing species here. It can live miles from an open body of water. Sometimes they live next to water, they often do, but sometimes they can live miles from open bodies of water. So similar to the other studies, to investigate this question on the variation in their claws, I got measurements of their claw size, their body size. I conducted territorial staged encounters between the stream-dwelling species that do engage in aggression, and then I also measured their strength using the same methods as before. Okay, so when we look at this data, what we're looking at here is the residual strength. So this is the amount of variation in your strength for a given size. And we can see that for each species. So these are all the stream-dwelling species. We have males on top and females on bottom. And these are the burrowing species, males on top, females on bottom. That the lifestyle, stream-dwelling versus burrowing, does not predict the amount of variation. We're expecting extremely little variation in the burrowers because remember, we think that the burrowers should have selection for very specific sizes and strengths because they need to burrow. Whereas the stream dwellers, if these variable signals function as dishonest signals, then we should have all this variation that's present in the other species. And no matter how you look at it, species doesn't predict the variation, the lifestyle doesn't predict the variation, the sex doesn't predict the variation. There's just tons of variation, okay? So every single species that I looked at here has these extremely variable claws, okay? And when we look at the fighting data, each different color here is depicted by, represents a different species. We see that regardless of whether interactions were resolved through signaling or through physical fights, that body size predicted the outcome of these contests, okay? So it was all body size. It wasn't claw size. It wasn't claw strength. It wasn't what we would have predicted. And now we have evidence from multiple species that, they're not using these claws as signals, despite these claws being extremely variable and possessing all this variation in strength. So we see that claw size unreliably predicted the claw strength, but the outcome of aggression was determined entirely by body size. Okay, and this is not what we expected at all. At least it's not what we predicted, because we thought that there was going to be dishonesty because of these unreliable claws. Okay, so we did not find support for any evolutionary function of these signals in the crayfish. So we see that the stomatopods, there's only evidence from one species here, the mantis shrimp. And it was fairly good evidence, although there was low sample size. To my knowledge, it has not been replicated or further studied. Fiddler crabs with the regenerated with the normal claw and the regenerated claw, there's some good data. There's some great data, and it's with multiple species. Although a proper, real comparative or phylogenetic approach has never been used, there's good evidence that that type of dishonesty has evolved in fiddler crabs. And every species, to my knowledge, every species that has been looked at has this same system of dishonest communication. With the crayfish, it's a little bit more complicated. They have these extremely variable claws, but the claws do not function in the way that we would predict if they were being dishonest signals. Okay, so I collected this data from multiple species. I tried it from multiple levels of analysis, and no matter what I did not get a really clean story. So, it's hard to tell what's going on with the crayfish. Some species, there may be dishonest signaling in crayfish, but I think more work needs to be done overall, and perhaps different types of experiments, maybe an even more comparative approach. It's really hard to tell. Maybe the species I picked were completely wrong. But one of the big take-homes that I learned from this, and that is very undocumented in the literature, is that unreliability, so this variation, does not necessarily equal dishonesty. So a lot of papers were actually measuring just claw size and claw strength variation and proposing that if there's variation, then it means that they're dishonest. But that's not true at all, because I showed in all these different experiments there was tons of variation, but they did not use these claws as dishonest signals of their strength. So this is kind of like the big story that I'm trying to tell, and trying to separate out, this variation that we don't know what it's from. Perhaps it's developmental or has to do with some other physiological process, and trying to understand whether or not this variation functions as dishonesty or not. And everyone was just assuming that it does function as a dishonest signal beforehand, despite not having the behavioral experiments like I conducted to prove that. So the crustaceans have historically been great organisms for studying this, but crayfish, it's fairly hard to tell. And I have lots of ideas as to why that is. And the key, I think, is in the development. So the one story that I didn't tell here, the one level of analysis that I did not discuss, which is development. I think it has something to do with the molting process and the variation in claw strength throughout the molting process. Because when they molt, they have to regenerate, they have to atrophize and destroy all of their muscle within their claw. And then they have to regrow it all. And there's probably so much variation in how strong you are within and between a molt that this creates a system where you have no idea how strong you are. You have no idea your abilities. So it functions in some species as dishonesty, but in other species, it just creates this extreme amount of variation that I'm able to look at here. And it's really hard to tell, but I have experiments planned on this, and lots of further ideas that I really want to test out. So with that, I just want to thank everyone for taking the time out of your day to watch this. I would love to answer any questions if you have any. I'll probably unshare my screen now, and maybe Alex will pop back in. That was about 40 minutes, so that's not bad. I want to end that there, even though I could talk for longer, of course. Okay,
so thank you, cool. Zach, for your presentation.
Yep.
It was very, very cool, even though I know the work.
Yeah, I know.
And we have two questions. Do you want me to ask you, or do you want to to relay them to you, or do you want to read them in the comments?
Yeah, from Marcelo.
Yeah, and Joseph Eduardo.
Yes, I can. Okay, let me read them real quick. Do you consider other species combinations in interspecific fights? I ask because I'm curious whether you would find similar results in a fight between two faxinized species. So I think that the interspecific fights, so the faxinized and the Procambarus that I studied, they're fairly unrelated and they do not share an common recent evolutionary history. One of them is from a different part of the United States, and the other is from a completely different part of the United States. And they're actually both brought to Arizona about 60 years ago. So that could also play some role in the results. But I think if it was between more similar species, we might find something different. But that's why I did the intraspecific fights, and I've done over 150 of them or so by now. And no matter what, it's not a clear picture demonstrating that these signals function, or these claws function as dishonest signals. But perhaps more closely related species that share an evolutionary history, perhaps they live in the same stream or they live in the same lake for thousands of years, I might get a different result, and I would love to do some type of follow-up regarding that. And then you said, moreover, there is an issue of how much information individuals of different species are able to exchange. Yeah, exactly. So that's kind of what I wanted to investigate when I started the study. I wanted to first show that this, or at least find out if dishonesty was occurring within a species. And my idea originally was that dishonesty might be occurring within a species, but between the species, they cannot communicate. They cannot communicate as adaptively because they've evolved different morphological, behavioral, and chemical signals to communicate. And actually, that is what one of my most recent papers is on that in animal behavior. So you might be interested in looking at that.
I just saw a bit of a backstory. Marcelo is the guy that works with the crayfish in southern Brazil.
Yeah, so, I recognize the name. I've read the paper.
Okay.
So, but thank you for the question. Appreciate it. Okay. Do you think other traits might be contributing to complement the signal of one specific structure? For example, I suppose the size of the crab's claw correlates with body mass. Even if the individual loses his claw, he's still larger than the others. In this case, body mass may produce similar information of the original claw, then the signal is not dishonest. Yeah, I agree. So there is lots of variation between body size and claw size within and between species, but certainly other traits could be better predicting the outcome of fight. So the species I studied, maybe body size is actually the best predictor because they need to be able to manipulate each other around and throw each other around. And it could be that the actual fighting behavior of the species I studied is fairly different than the fighting behavior of previously studied species. Other things that could be predicting the outcome of fight are, the stamina of the individual, or perhaps, just their motivation to fight, or even their skill, their specific use of the number and the intensity of times that they're able to strike each other. So there's obviously some more complex things going on, and I'm actually having students look into that actively to really try to understand if the species I'm studying are really different or I'm missing something. So yeah, great question. Thank you for that. Okay.
I think I have one.
Sure.
Yeah. So I was thinking about how you found that claws are unreliable, but they're not necessarily dishonest.
Yeah, I did not find support for them functioning as dishonest signals.
Yeah. So do you think that maybe that's just because condition dependence can evolve regardless of whether it's being used as a signal or not?
Yes, I do.
Even a reliable signal.
Yeah, I think that it can. So the amount of resources that the individual can get will obviously, or maybe their genetic or environmental quality will obviously influence the size and the strength variation that I was discussing. But generally, there's really no way of describing that and thinking about it. People have only been recently describing this dishonesty as a statistical property of a relationship. And, you know, people are not doing that as much as they should, and, you know, detecting whether, you know, how tight of a correlation is a really good correlation, and is this attributed to, you know, genes and the environment and how they influence the size of the signal or the strength of the signal. But I agree that the condition dependence likely plays a role, and that's what I'm trying to get at with some future experiments on the development of this variation and the condition dependence, so kind of the interaction between those two and how it manifests itself. You know, and whether or not this variation is, it could be me. You know, even though I find the claw strength is really repeatable, it could be that there's just variation in me. You know, but it's very unlikely. But yeah, I'm trying to do lots of different experiments to understand where this is coming from, with how much nutrition plays a role.
Yeah, because I don't know if you saw the abstract on ABS that Dan and I did a little model on condition dependency and animal weapons, but we show that in the model we show that the signaling doesn't have to do anything doesn't need to exist for weapons to be condition dependent. So maybe your work kind of just proves the point that they're not dishonest. They just, because to be dishonest, it needs to be interpreted as a signal in order for the animals to.
Yeah, definitely. And the thing that's weird is that in some of the species, the claw size didn't matter, or the claw strength didn't matter. And of course, the body size is condition dependent as well, right? But you know, it's just different than other species that have been studied. So no one's really had to come up with explanations or think about it, because everyone assumed that they used claw size as signals, and everyone assumed that they use claw strength when they're actually engaging in a fight. But my research kind of makes it more complicated and confusing than that, and we have to think of other explanations.
Yeah.
Great.
Let's see.
Anyone else?
Yeah, I don't think so. It kind of takes a little while for questions to pop up, because they first show on YouTube and then they pop up here.
Yeah.
I'm checking on here if anyone is asking.
Cool.
But actually, Marcelo, during his PhD, we did some tests fighting some Parastachus from different species, and also fighting Parastachus with aglids.
And they're all burrowers, the Parastachus?
Yeah. We have like only one species of string-dwelling crayfish here, and it's in Chile, so we can't get there.
Okay. Yeah.
Yeah, and
is that the Viralaticus or something?
Yeah, that one. Exactly. Yeah, that
cool.
one. So it's pretty far away.
Yeah. Yeah, so it's interesting. I think, you know, my comparative ideas aren't super comparative. They're not comparative enough to, like, you know, rule out some things, but it's, you know, it's as much as I could do, and I'd love to do more, obviously, to try to really understand, because I think not many people have been investigating this in crustaceans, despite it being one of the best, probably the best empirical system to investigate these questions, at least as it pertains to fighting behavior, for sure.
Yeah, agree.
Yeah, definitely.
So I think that's it.
All right.
No one more curious. So
yeah, thank you, everyone. You can email me if you have any questions. I think it was on the slide, zgram1@asu.edu. If you would like copies of any of my papers, I can send them to you, or you can ask for them on ResearchGate, or they may be available on ResearchGate, I believe. So yeah, a lot of the stuff that I could only talk about so much, and I really wanted to stick with the dishonesty story, but there's obviously a lot more in that data that we can use to learn about these, you know, species.
Wait, Marcelo has one more question.
Okay.
He's typing.
Great.
He's a slow typer ever since grad school.
It's all good. I think my earbuds are going to die. I'm going to disconnect them real quick and see if it...
A gente está esperando a pergunta do Marcelo, mas obrigado a todos que assistiram a palestra do Zack. Espero que tenham aprendido sobre os nossos maravilhosos crustáceos.
Thank you, everyone. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, make it sure.
Yeah. Just waiting. Why do you think strength was not important to win a contest?
So there's a few explanations. The one that I think is most likely is that the species that have been found to have strength as an important decider, their fighting behavior is actually fairly different. So the crayfish species that are well studied, that people think strength is important for, or the data shows that strength is important, those species are from Australia, completely different family, or completely different, subfamily of crayfish, and their fighting behavior is a little bit different. They have multiple bouts of tapping their claws together, and they spend a lot more time assessing each other than the species that I study, anecdotally, of course. And I know the data would back that up. It's a very different fighting style. Whereas the species that I study, there's a lot of pushing and claw interlocking, and I think what they're trying to do is flip each other over and manipulate each other. And it's not necessarily the pinching, but it's just their ability to kind of throw their weight around. So it's kind of like the species I study are like heavyweight boxers, and the species in Australia that our previous research was on, they're kind of like lightweight boxers. They have different fighting styles. That's my interpretation. I was supposed to be in Australia in a month to investigate these types of questions. Of course, that's not happening, but hopefully at some point during my life, I'll be able to, ask that.
Yeah.
But it is interesting. Yeah, the aglids, I'm sure that, it was very surprising to me as well that body size predicted everything in one species and claw size predicted everything. It's like, they pinch each other, but it doesn't seem to be as important. And it's not like I'm going off of 20 fights. This is like 150 fights, 200 fights total, and it's all the same exact same answer. And it's not like claw strength has any weight in any of these models. It's all body size in that study, for example. So I'm fairly confident. Yeah, very confident. Yeah, thank you so much, Marcelo. Very nice to meet you.
So that's it. Now we can close. So
Great.
Thank you again, Zach. Keep in touch. And if you want to say your final words here.
Yeah, just thanks again to everyone. Again, you can email me, look me up on ResearchGate. If you want my papers, let me know. If you have any ideas, if you think this is all, bull crap, let me know. I would love to know. I love thinking about it and learning from people that have different opinions. So don't be shy and feel free to send me an email.
Isso aí, então, obrigado, pessoal, de novo. Espero que vocês tenham gostado. E qualquer coisa, se quiserem também falar com o Zack, é só falar comigo, eu boto vocês em contato também, não tem problema. Então, qualquer coisa é só avisar. Isso aí. Bye.